Welcome to the Momentum Experiment podcast. My name is Kat, and I teach about momentum, how to find it and also how to keep it. And if you're not familiar, I developed a framework that is called the Momentum Formula, and it helps people understand the different ways that you can get stuck. Maybe if you're having trouble getting started, or if you are struggling to stay with it, you get started and then you kind of stall again. And this is something that's a little bit more recent for me. So before I started teaching this framework, I was actually teaching virtual presenting primarily on YouTube. And ironically, I had some real momentum going on that channel for a while, and my tutorials have actually had over 2 million views. But I lost my momentum, and I'm going to get into that in this episode. Share a little bit about what I've learned. I had a slight wake up call, and that has informed what I'm doing now. So, I'm going to talk about why I'm doing this podcast, take you behind the scenes of why I've decided to try this format. And when I say this format, I mean recording these episodes live, which is not the first one to do it, but not a lot of people do it. And I think there's a good reason why. But I'll be giving you some insight into what happened, what's the instigating moment, and what are some of the things I've learned using the momentum formula in order to make this decision and this judgment call. I'm also going to share a little bit about what's next and what you can expect, because today is the very first episode. So we're going behind the scenes. Let's start off with why a podcast, because there are lots of ways that I could share about this concept, these ideas, but I do want to get into the why. Now, before I do that, there is a case that you may have never actually heard of the momentum formula, the framework, or maybe you just like a little refresher. So I want to explain a little bit about it. And the first concept is to understand that when you are stuck, if you do not have momentum, there are actually three ways you can get stuck. At least that is what I believe. So when we think about these roadblocks, the first roadblock you can experience is when you have a logical roadblock. You are stuck because you're missing information, you're missing skills, you maybe don't have the tools to move forward. So you actually can't move forward until you solve that and you fill that gap. The next type of roadblock is what I call a biological challenge. This is where you are working against how you're wired. Maybe you're trying to follow advice or follow a plan that just doesn't actually suit you, whether that's how you're wired, your preferences, your expectations. And then finally, there's psychological. And psychological roadblocks are when you are getting in your own way. So this is more of a mental roadblock where you are self-sabotaging or you're letting fear get in the way. You've got some assumptions or beliefs, and these are blocking you from making progress. And so that those are the three different types. And what I often see is that almost all of us want to solve every roadblock or when we're stuck like it's logical because that's the thing we're most comfortable with. It's using our problem-solving skills. But we can often ignore the fact that there's something else potentially going on, whether that is working against what naturally works for us, or we've got some kind of hidden under the surface fears that are going on. So when you have one of these roadblocks, you need to approach them, and each approach is going to be different. So for a logical roadblock, you need a method. This is a clear, complete method, including knowing what to do, having the skills to do it, and also the tools in the implementation. For a biological challenge, you need to address the mode. This is all about what works for me. How am I actually wired? What's my style of working? And if you think about if you've ever been to a fitness class where the fitness instructor will say, okay, this is how you do the exercise, but here's a modification because not everyone moves the same way. Some people have limitations. And then finally, psychological. This is all about mindset and needing to look at your mindset, why you might be holding yourself back, what is going on there. And once we address that mindset, we can sort of free ourselves from fears that are holding us back. So when you have all three of these, the method, the mode, and the mindset, this is how you find your momentum, but also keep it because you can be sustainable, consistent, but also aligned when you have all of these things together. So that is a little preview of, okay, this is what the framework is. And when I explain it to people, they will often tell me, oh, I get it. But how does that work in real life? And they want explanations. And so I thought one of the best things I could do is share with you examples in the real world, both my own and other people's examples of how you actually use this framework, how to use method, how to use mode, how to use mindset in order to address these problems. Or how do you even figure out which roadblock you're facing? Because it's not always obvious on the surface. And so when you hear real examples, it'll start to make sense. Now, the reason I went with podcast is because, well, two main reasons. First is unlike my past tutorials, when I would teach tech tutorials and presenting gear, I had to show it. Or if I was doing a tutorial that was step by step, you needed to look at the screen so I could show you what to do and you could follow along. But with these concepts, they are much more audio friendly. This is something that you could just listen to, and you don't need to be looking at a screen in order to understand these concepts. The second main reason is that I would have often conversations with friends where I would talk about how I was using the framework in my own life. And I have a few friends who would are so patient, and they would get voice notes from me, and I would hear feedback like, "Oh, that's so helpful. This is the kind of stuff you should be sharing." And I realized, yeah, they're right. It's like having a conversation. So I do want this podcast to feel like you're having a conversation with a friend who's a bit of a nerd about this stuff and wants to share insight, information, maybe ask you some questions that you can consider, but also just share my own experiences of how I'm taking my own advice and using this framework for real challenges. And I will be sharing things that I'm actively working on right now that I haven't fully figured out. So this podcast is one of those things, and it comes down to content. So I want to share a little bit about why I've decided to do this live. And this decision came out of a recent experience I had where I was invited to speak to a group of entrepreneurs who use YouTube for their business. And I was specifically asked to come in so I could talk about my strategy of going live, which I used for the first 18 months of my other YouTube channel. I went live almost every week. I took a few breaks, holidays, summer, etc. But I would go live kind of like I'm doing right now. I would talk at the start, talk at the end, but I would just chop out that middle content, and then that would stay up online on my channel. And as I was preparing for this talk, I started to look at the numbers, and I hadn't really looked at my numbers in a very long time. And when I looked at this, I realized I did the calculation. Over the 18 months that I was going live, I averaged about 3 videos a month. So that takes into account times with holidays, breaks, etc. When I then swapped and I decided I was going to start making recorded content and recorded tutorials instead, over the subsequent 2 years, I averaged 1.3 video a month. That's less than half when I switched. And I knew that I was not as consistent when I was recorded. I just never really looked at it in the face like that when I was looking at those numbers. And also at that time, I hadn't developed the framework yet. I didn't have the same perspective I have now. So it suddenly became quite obvious what was going on. And I'm going to explain that to you today because really it turns out that going live works with how I'm wired and it suits me really well. Recording video, not so much, not so much. And I'll actually explain with the framework in mind and explain these things. So one of the things I want to share with the formula is that when I say method, I am talking about having a plan. That's another way you could say it. But it incorporates 3 things for me, or four things. One is knowing what to do, so that having the information that you need. The other is how to do it. And I think of this as skills. Do you actually have the skills? Sometimes we need to practice, and it might take a little bit of trial and error until you know how to do something. And then it's also implementation. So when are you doing this? Where are you doing this? And also, what tools do you need? When I say tools, I do not necessarily mean tech or technology. If you are trying to establish a running habit, then tools would be an example of running shoes are a tool. You need them to run. You also need to know when and where you're going to run. You need to know how long you're going for, what's your technique, and then you also have to actually get out there and try. So a method, when we're looking at something that's complete, that is clear, and that's also effective, it's going to move you forward. Now, in my case with creating content and sharing content, when I was both going live and recording videos, I had a method that was complete. I knew what to do, I knew how to do it. I also had a schedule for each week that I tried to follow, and I also had all of the tools. So I did have a complete method, but I noticed that when I switched to recorded, I started skipping videos that I had planned to make. I would push back when I would publish them. I was also taking way too long to make the videos. They were just ballooning to take up just so much more time than when I was going live. And so what I realized is the issue is actually with my mode. And the mode also has four components. Now, I use the acronym BEEP when I talk about the mode, but this stands for biology, environment, expectations, and preferences. Now, I'm not going to go deep into all of them. In particular, actually, I just want to talk about three for me for this example. And the first is expectations. When I was going live, I would tell people I'm going to be live at this time. And so I would show up, even if I didn't feel like it that day. Maybe I had a bit of a headache. Maybe I didn't sleep well. I said I was going to be there. Other people might show up. So I'm going to show up. That was what I would consider a real expectation. And it worked. I showed up even when I didn't want to. But when it switched to recorded video, that changed. I would think, oh, I'm not feeling up to it today. Maybe I can do this next week. Nobody's really sitting there waiting for a specific release date. Now, this is personal to me. Some people, their release date, that is an external expectation. But for me, it wasn't strong enough. I would just kind of push it back and have those excuses. And this is because people are wired differently for their expectations. And also, I highly recommend The Four Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin, where she explains that we respond to inner and outer expectations, where we either tend to meet them or resist them. And I am a person who tends to resist inner expectations, but I tend to meet outer expectations. So if I have a goal and I don't have any outer expectations, by creating them, like saying, I am going to go live at this time, that was my way of turning something into an outer expectation. And just saying I publish videos every Thursday or something, that wasn't enough for me when it came to recorded content. The other thing with environment is that when I go live and there are actually people there, they're in the chat, they're being supportive, they're asking questions, that is amazing for me. It's a way to create content that is fulfilling. It lifts me up. I love it. It's a sense of community. And one of those things is that that environment it feels collective. When I think about the environment of just recording content on your own, it can feel really, really isolating as well. So when I looked at environment and the way I like to work, I do really like the live format. I mean, I'm always someone who has enjoyed running workshops, running live classes. And so it's not surprising that the environment I would gravitate towards or where I really feel present and alive is when other people are around. And then the final one I want to touch on today is preferences. And that's just what you like. And for me, I love presenting to a live audience. Now, many people hate this. I know that I might be an outlier, but I love running a workshop or doing a presentation or speaking. And so when I would go live, it felt like that. And that's what I like. And I like creating content that way. So what I'm saying here about the mode is it's all about working with how you're wired. And when you have that effective and complete method combined with a mode that works for you, it's sustainable. If we're working against ourselves, it's like swimming against a current. It's like, yes, you could probably make it across the lake, even if there's a current against you, but you're not going to want to show up and do it over and over and over again. And so to be sustainable, you want the combination of both of those things. Now, I do want to touch on mindset because mindset is also part of this. And when I think about mindset, I like to break it down into, we have our why. This is the thing that drives us. I also like to use the term desired identity, the person we want to be. And a lot of traditional advice says tap into your why. You need to know your why. But a lot of traditional advice also sort of doesn't address the question of the why not, that other half. And it's this dreaded identity, the person we don't want to be. And when it came to my content creation in the past, I think this did play a role where when I was going live, I had this certain expectation of I'm showing up, this is live, it's interactive, mistakes are going to happen. When I switched to recorded content, suddenly my mindset shifted. And I think that my expectations went up where I felt like the quality had to go up. It had to be better. It had to be more polished. I couldn't have mistakes. If it wasn't a good take, I should do another one because this is recorded. And I started to put a lot of pressure on myself of what the end result should be. And I think part of it is I didn't want to come across as someone who's making recorded content for YouTube and sucks at it. And I know that that seems like a stretch because I've been making content for a while. People were finding it, they were watching it. So, what's the difference? But in my head, my mindset and my assumptions about the difference between live and between recorded, it shifted things for me. And I think it elevated those expectations. Now, I won't get into this in this specific episode, but there were other things going on at the time that were affecting me, especially with my why. And I started to question, why am I doing this and what am I doing this for? And so it wasn't just all mode. There were things going on in my life at those times where I was inconsistent, where I wasn't showing up regularly. So it wasn't exclusively about the content. And I just want to emphasize that sometimes there are other things that are going on that are playing a factor of why we might be holding ourselves back. But that gives you an essence of why live actually suits me so much better. When I look at that mode, just showing up, presenting like I'm talking to a live audience, which I am right now. And if you are listening to the recording, you're welcome to join for the live version. Now, the other reason that I was gravitating towards this way of creating content, the recording live and then putting up the recording the next day, is that we are currently living in a world that is just full of AI generated content. And there are people predicting that AI generated content is going to, in a year or two, it's going to be 90% of the content that's out there. That is frankly just frightening to me, but I can already see it happening. And even as a consumer, when I go and look at stuff, I know that some content of people I admire is actually being generated by AI. And it's getting harder to trust what's real and what's not. And I think that by showing up live, where you could come and be in the chat and I can answer questions in real time, so you know it's me that you're actually talking to. And even if you aren't joining live, just knowing that you could be there and that that is how I'm recording it, I think it just adds an element of knowing that, yes, this is me. I am showing up and doing this. I am not just entering a script that was generated by AI to use my voice and my likeness to create content. I am not doing that with this podcast. Now, as for this experiment, and this whole podcast is an experiment that, based on my past experience, based on what I know about how I work and how I'm wired, my hypothesis is that I will be more consistent and I'll also take less time because I have that constraint of just showing up at this time. You need to be ready and trusting that the content is going to be good enough. And we're going to find out if this works as well as I think it's going to work. Will I actually be consistent? Will I manage my time better? I mean, I guess you'll find out, and it helps if you subscribe or follow the podcast. Shameless plug. Now, for what's next, I'm going to be sharing other experiments in my life, things that I am currently working on, things that I have been struggling with, and looking through the framework and applying it. So you'll get an example of this is what it looks like to use the momentum formula in order to make adjustments. And it is about testing, it's about trial and error. And I'll also use the podcast to dive a little deeper into some of the concepts that I've mentioned today, and also some concepts I haven't mentioned around the framework and how you can use this model. And I'd love to answer your questions. So if you have questions, please let me know. You can leave them in the YouTube comments. I also have a forum that I'm going to link to so that you could submit a question. And then that way I can also use those questions going forward for this podcast. But that's a little look behind the scenes of why I decided to do this way. Do it this way, why I'm recording the podcast live, also just why I'm doing the podcast at all. And I do sincerely hope that you will join me for this experiment.